What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip. And today on the podcast, a longtime podcast favorite, friend, Grace G. Sun Kim is back, and we're talking about her new book, When God Became White. That's right. Yeah, that's the title. Quite a catchy title, quite a provocative one, and it sets up a quite enjoyable conversation about one of the most challenging tasks facing the life of the church. Now, before we hop into this episode, I want to give a big shout out to our sponsor of this episode, Garrett Seminary. That's right, seminary education isn't just for pastors. Social awareness of the world's most pressing problems, robust ethical analysis, empathic biblical wisdom, and courageous leadership are skills you can use across a wide range of vocations. Whether you feel called to care and counseling, public service, prophetic arts, or nonprofit management, there's a degree program at Garrett Seminary that's just right for you. Our global faculty and diverse student body nurture class discussions that reflect the contextual realities in the communities you'll serve. And our commitment to hands-on learning means you'll have plenty of opportunities that put that knowledge to use. Located in the heart of Northwestern's campus, just a short train ride from Chicago, let our city be your training ground. Garrett also offers fully online and hybrid programs. So wherever and whoever you are, apply to begin your fulfilling new career today. Learn more at garrett.edu/homebrewed. That's Garrett, GARRETT.edu/homebrewed. Thank you, Garrett Seminary, for sponsoring the episode. And thank you, Grace, for writing another excellent book so we get to hang out on the internet. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Grace G. Sun Kim. New book, When God Became White. And now, last time you were on, you were talking about this book, and you were excited it was coming out. Now it's out, and has anyone asked you how you found out God was white?
I found out. I don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyways, first, thank you so much, Trip, for having me back. It's always like the best to be on your podcast. So thank you so much for having me. I've done a ton of podcast interviews for this book. I guess the most out of all my other books. And someone may have asked me that question, but I kind of grew up with the white male God, and I never questioned it. It was something that was engraved in my mind and my heart, that's how God is. And, also growing up in Asia, you don't kind of question things that are kind of taught to you. So if I was already taught that in Sunday school and in so many different churches that I attended throughout my life, you don't question it. So yeah, it was always this part of me. But I know other podcast hosts have asked me that question. So thanks for starting off with that tough one.
Well, one of the things that it shows up as you go through these different places in which whiteness is revealed to be, in a sense, a normative choice as opposed to just the reality of the gospel or who God is. Part of that, each time someone encounters that, there's this terror of, oh no, it was like there were a stack of assumptions I didn't even know needed a question mark. And now what do I do with it? And I wonder if you've learned something in your life about the power of just raising the question, because so much of our imagination is just repeating what's inherited unless we open it up.
So I think there is so much power in asking questions. And, as I mentioned earlier, many Asians, we're not encouraged to ask questions. We're encouraged to learn and take in everything. So I think more in the West, you're taught to ask questions. I think it was much later in my life that I started to question everything because so much of what I was taught just didn't make any sense. So I think, that has paid off because it's usually because of the questions that I start writing another book. And, I was thrilled to speak about this book very briefly at Homebrewed Beer Camp. That was very exciting. And so I think questioning is very, very important. And I encourage that with my 3 kids and with my students that I teach, that there's just so much in the world And theology is not this hard science. It isn't. So, yeah, and even if it was, the hard sciences, you got to question everything, that comes along.
One of the chapters that I found extremely compelling is the one on missiology.
Okay.
I think a lot of times people are protective of their theology
Mhm.
because the theology is giving birth to a way of being in the world, both as an individual Christian and as a church. And so the moment a theology question comes up, you're like, well, whoa, whoa. Well, if I'm putting a question there, that changes everything that I think being a Christian or what the church's mission is to do. As you kind of deconstructed the way a white missiology was just inherent in your context and started to problematize it, what did you learn about the history of the church's mission that needs to be deconstructed and set aside to recenter around something other than whiteness?
Well, Christian history and the missiology has been whiteness, whether we have labeled it or not. And that's something that the church really has to wrestle with. It's a really bad part of Christian history. Susan and I wrote the book Intersectional Theology. I think everything intersects. So, this idea of race, ethnicity, and this notion of whiteness, white supremacy is connected and intersecting with colonialism and mission and, sharing the gospel. So, I think much of Christian theology has really studied a bit more on Africa. So how, the missionaries went to Africa and what has happened. Less so in Asia, or at least from my own reading. So I think when I was first starting the book, I had no intention of writing a chapter on this, but I felt it necessary, especially from my own context, because I was always taught that these white missionaries, most of them were American and Canadian and British, came and did a miracle in Korea. We're only good because these white missionaries came. And, growing up in the church, I have met so many Presbyterian ministers who were missionaries or children of missionaries. And I had to, I grew up just adoring them and thanking them and being so grateful because I was always taught that they came to do good. Everything that they did was good. But, when I think about the results and the effects, and then researching about what the missionaries did, so we know that there was a lot of damage in Africa with these white, particularly European missionaries. We don't hear so much about the consequences or the problems that happened in Asia, particularly Korea. So for me, during the research and, reading some of these white missionaries' perspective about Koreans was really heartbreaking to me because they were so critical of Koreans. In the book, I mentioned, they're lazy people who sat around and, had nothing to do all day. And they smoked these long pipes. So in Korea, traditionally, we had these long pipes. It's not the short ones like in Europe and here in North America. So that's the characteristics that these white missionaries had of Koreans. And they lived lavishly. They brought their own wood from America and built these big homes. And they knew that Korea, it was after the war or during the war or, the Japanese colonialism. We were in really bad shape because Korea, it's a tiny little peninsula surrounded by China and Japan. And we were invaded by either China or Japan throughout our history. So, we weren't a wealthy country, and the missionaries knew we weren't wealthy, but they lived so well because their monthly salary was the same as if they worked in North America. So it was really high, and the standard of living in Korea was really poor, was really low. So they paid Koreans to do all their work, like cleaning and laundry and doing, the menial task, and paid us peanuts. So I don't know, it just gives this wrong, a vibe of what the missionaries and how they treated us and viewed us as we are the other. And so that's really painful for me, but that's the reality of this missiology of whiteness. where whiteness is intertwined and intersecting with their understanding of how they're going to bring the gospel and how they treat the people that they're trying to share the gospel with. And they weren't very kind and didn't look upon us as, educated or advanced. We were kind of the barbaric, lazy, backwards kind of people to them. So, Trip, that was really painful for me, especially after growing up with the white male God and meeting so many missionaries or missionary kids who lived and served in Korea.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the challenges of a colonialist legacy is that
Yeah.
the binding of the culture in which the colonialist comes from to the divine,
Just-
right? And so anytime a domination system can't differentiate itself from the gospel, then you show up and you're like, well, why would I give up, the pinnacle of culture, namely like this kind of Anglo-European framework? This is what we're coming to give everyone along with Jesus. Um, and I think that's like you can see in retrospect how people didn't even know to ask that question,
Wait,
and yet it ends up not just kind of like continuing it within Anglo-centered religion. It also introduces people to the gospel and says it's intimately tied to this very Western way of existing.
well, that's the whole message of the book too, that this downplay of Aboriginals, natives, wherever the white missionaries went, kind of downplaying them. And I think Edward Said's book, Orientalism, that is exactly how the white missionaries viewed Asia and those of, Asian descent. So it is really, really heartbreaking. And, we just thought because the missionaries told us, to be saved, you have to accept this gospel and negating all of our rich cultural history, our rich religious history. Because even remember my parents, once we converted, that happened after we immigrated, but then, seeing how the rest of my family in Korea converted, really saying, okay, if they were from the Buddhist, which most of our family was, that it is so evil. It's like the worst thing in the world. Because that's what the missionaries told them. I remember visiting my grandmother when I was about 9 years old. So after we immigrated, we went back. And my mother, we were all, Christians, very, conservative, evangelical Christians. And my grandmother wasn't a Christian yet. And, she lived in this tiny little 2-bedroom house, which was very traditional Korean house. And she had these red strings hanging on the corner of the room from the ceiling. I never noticed it until my mother saw it. And then she started freaking out, saying, "That's the sign of the devil," she said. But that was too shamanistic or something. And she freaked out. Everybody was trying to tell her to calm down. She got a chair, went up there and yanked it down. And everybody was like so shocked that my mother was acting like this. But that, the internalization of all whiteness and European was good. And anything, I'm sure that my grandmother just put it up maybe as decoration. I don't know. My mother saw that as evil and she freaked out that now Satan's going to be in this house, even to that extent. So, we have a lot of unpacking to do. Oh, and this whiteness, continues on today. And I've written many blogs and pieces on like this, even this westernization of beauty, that Asian women aren't even beautiful. So we have to look Western to look beautiful. And when you look at the number one capital of facial plastic surgery, it's actually Korea. Body, I think, is Brazil, but facial reconstruction is Korea. So every Korean woman wants a bigger nose like white woman, bigger eyes like white woman, and our cheek or our jawline is too square. So everything is being reconstructed and men are doing it. So this, it has long-lasting effects. When missionaries came and said everything that you're doing is backwards and barbaric and, you don't even look that beautiful. So you should be like us. Everything was you should be like us, Western people, Western technology, Western medicine. All of that was ingrained, and you see remnants of it still today, within our culture, this whole westernization of Korea and many parts of Asia.
hmm You mentioned in the book and just a minute ago, Edward Said, and I wonder for people who haven't read kind of any post-colonial theory and such, like how would they, from that lens, how do you begin to frame the question of colonialism and the process of dismantling and disengaging from it?
Well, Edward Said does a great job in his book, Orientalism, how the West has Orientalized. And this Orientalism is this process of making us inferior, feminine, kind of you need to be taught things because you don't know enough. So when we think about dualism and, that which Christianity is so heavily ingrained and based in. So you have masculine and feminine, spirit and body, heaven and earth. So one side is always good, the masculine, and then the feminine, the Sophia or the body or the earth is the bad part or the weaker. So, feminizing Asia and those who are in that area, those had consequences because the West viewed us as less than, as the other, as inferior, as unintelligent being. And that's the lens that the West has viewed us. And so when that is married then with Christianity, it becomes very problematic because Christianity is viewed as a white Western religion. So it is this empire building intersecting with Christianity, and you can't even separate the two at times. It's so intertwined. So even, the book is looking at Jesus and God and how Jesus and God became white. Jesus, a Palestinian Jew, born in this Middle East kind of Palestine area, suddenly, he is this homeless man, a prophet, a teacher, a rabbi, roaming around from one village or a city to the other. Slowly, the Christian European artist, turned him into this white European prince, wearing a white robe. So they've already turned him into a prince or a king or an emperor because then that will legitimize all this missiology of whiteness. What Edward Said is talking about, this Orientalism, that they can now package their message so well to legitimize their own superiority because Jesus is now no longer this Palestinian Jew, a white princely figure that is just like them. And so you can package that and then continue to really downplay us. And there's huge consequences. And you still see this now because it is Europeans who have colonized not just Asia, but South America and Africa. So the consequences have been huge. And much of the colonization was intersecting with this missiology. We're going to share the good news, but we're also going to take their resources and their land and their people and enslave them, etc., etc.
This is something we touched on a previous conversation, but I think it makes sense here to discuss that process of Jesus becoming white,
Yeah.
how the word white's being used there. I think some people hear it and they only hear, oh, it's a color, and maybe it's attached to a culture or something. And then you used the language, I think last time, or maybe Susan, one of you did, about it's what it's legitimating that's the problem. So when Jesus becomes white, it generates a legitimation structure that preserves not whiteness as a color, but whiteness as a power structure.
Yeah.
Because something else that you see in a lot of the liberation theologies, like when James Cone talks about Jesus being black,
Wow.
or when you read Muhuritista theology, like all these, those are legitimations, but from a very different orientation of power.
Yeah.
One that, right, coheres with Jesus' own place of power that was erased in the turning a Palestinian white.
Yeah. So, when we're talking about whiteness and racism, always power is tied to it. You cannot separate it. That's the basis of why these terms, these social constructs exist, because it wants to allow one group power over the other. So I quote Mary Daly. I think she was brilliant. So everybody's familiar with her quote, "If God is male, then the male is God." It legitimizes all these men to kind of speak for God. So until, this 2,000-year history, it's only the last 50 years or maybe 100, maybe 200 at the most, where denominations, well, I can't speak for all because some would say they started to ordain much earlier. But anyway, it's very recent history in the 2,000-year history where we allow ordained women to be ordained. But this notion that Mary Daly is trying to get across, if God is male, then the male is God. It's this legitimization that only men can speak for God because they are closer to God. This dualism where women are inferior, they're farther away from God, and therefore women cannot speak for God or share the good news, which is so contradictory to the time of Jesus when he was surrounded by women. Women were there. Certainly, they weren't part of the 12 disciples, but he had a lot of other disciples and followers and supporters, and women were there. He spoke with women. Women served and women were there when he was speaking. And he speaks about Mary and Martha and Peter's mother in law. There are so many women, and Paul mentions the woman. Even after the crucifixion, it's the woman that come to anoint him, to put oil and spices on his body, and they're the first evangelists. So it's so contradictory to the whole message of Jesus and the whole gospel. But this is what happens when Jesus says, we are all equal, we're all children, but suddenly the white people are better than others, Asians and South Americans and Black people. So there is this legitimization of those in power. Those in power need other things to secure their power. So if it's going to be their gender that's going to help, you're going to uphold patriarchy. And that has happened throughout church history because under the Roman Empire, that Christianity growing, all the emperors were men. So, you got to uphold patriarchy. And if you want to continue to colonize and dominate over people and enslave people and take their resources under the guise that, oh, we're helping you, because that has happened in places like India. Oh, we're here to help you. In the meantime, they're taking all their diamonds and jewels, that Queen Elizabeth took, and all their resources, their silk and spices. So, and we're going to share the gospel with you. So I think we really, like Christianity and Christians really need to look at our history and repent, which is a word that, we progressives don't use, but I think we need to sometimes repent. And, as an Asian theologian, we use the word Han. So Han is always tied in with this notion of sin and repentance. So there's a lot of studying that we need to do, which I'm so grateful that Trip, you do this all the time, and to repent of our wrongdoings because we made God, well, white Europeans have made God in their own image. And that was not to be done. That was very clear in the Old Testament that you're not to create God in your graven image or anything like that. But we have continued to do that. But when someone in power does it, it just looks legitimate. That's the whole problem. So at the beginning, when you asked me that question, I never questioned it because if someone in power keeps teaching you this over and over again, you just don't question it. But I think now you got to question everything. I question everything that was taught to me during my childhood and my youth and my young adult.
Mm-hmm. Well, unlike a lot of our peers, you share quite a bit of your own story when you're writing.
Yeah.
Um, I think,
Maybe too much.
well, I'm gonna guess one of the side effects of whiteness is, it like if the obvious criticism is universalizing your own experience onto everyone, then you take it one step further and just abstract yourself from it and talk about God in such a vacuum, you wouldn't even know that the theologian
Sure.
was a human, you know? And you've shared about on the podcast before about the kind of rediscovering your own Korean heritage, the rediscovery of the images of the spirit and such. And I wonder, as a parent, what that's looked like. That and not just you, but like I mean, even the vision of the faith I was handed is one that was normatively white. And what have you learned about parenting, where so much of our religious institutions still have that inertia of whiteness in it? What does Christian parenting look like if you're trying to pass on a faith without it? When a lot of the hymns we sing, what happens in churches, even the form of the church life is built around the Western work week and all sorts of other things. Does that make sense? Because I wonder what you've learned in that, because
Yeah.
I know so many people who will resonate deeply with the ideas and then go, now what do I do? How do I even hand this faith on without it, and get uneasy?
Yeah. So, one day I hope to write a book on parenting because I'm asked that a lot, especially by women groups and other, church groups. They're always asking these questions. Not that I'm a great parent. Parenting is a lifelong learning thing and it involves patience, a ton of patience and, letting go. It involves everything. And, Trip, you and I have both 3 kids and that's a handful. But, when I was growing up as an immigrant child, I was just so embarrassed of being Korean. And, I put that in this book and I put it in my book, Invisible. But there's still a lot more that I didn't share. Even in this book, there's that one story that I shared about my parents. As immigrants, they did everything. And that's true of new immigrants today. You just have to do the jobs that's available to make money to feed your kids. So one of the jobs that they had was going out in the middle of the night to these golf clubs and picking worms at night. That is one of the most embarrassing things. My parents embarrass me all the time, and I'm sure I embarrass my kids too. But that was one of the most embarrassing things. And I found out much later, they were hiding it from me and my sister because they went out in the middle of the night and they came home before we got out. But then I found out because they were all yakking about it one day and I overheard what they were all speaking about. That's so embarrassing. That is like going on the ground, you know, picking up these dirty things to make a living. So I was really debating whether to share that story in the book. And the editor, Al Shu at InterVarsity Press, he was my other editor for Healing Our Broken Humanity. And he's like, "Oh, I love this story. And thank you for sharing it." And he's Chinese American, I don't know, third or fourth generation. And when he appreciated it, I thought, okay, then it's not that bad to share that story. Because I'm sure other Asians and other immigrants have similar stories. But every story I share, it's painful for me. And I'm always debating whether to include it or not. But at the end of the day, I include it. And I wrestled with the stories I included in the book Invisible too. Because I think it's important as you share to share our perspective. I think, Asian Americans are only 6.7% here in America. African Americans are about 13, 14%. So there's, more than double African Americans than Asian Americans. So we often hear more of their stories. And Asian Americans, because we live in this honor shame kind of culture where it's kind of, you shouldn't share embarrassing stories. So we even have less of it. So I'm like, okay, I got to share a bit more because I am sure I'm not the only one that felt this way, being so embarrassed of Korean culture, Korean language, and Korean food. And so, when I'm raising my kids, I want to make them proud. I talk about Korea as much as I with my kids. And, the time has changed from the 70s and 80s till now. Now we have K-pop and K-drama and so much Korean food all over the place. We have mukbang, which is watching people eat food in front of your laptop or your cell phone. So even though all of this is new and that wasn't part of when I was growing up, that does not mean that racism is gone. That's why I wrote the book, When God Became White, because 50 years later, when all of this is around and people know where Korea is, because in the 70s, people just thought I was making Korea up. They kept saying that there's Chinese and there's Japanese people, but there's no such thing as Korean. So, in the 70s and 80s and even 90s, when people didn't even think Korea or Koreans were real, till now where, we have all of this, the racism is still rampant. And this whiteness is it's problematic and it's damaging. So as a parent, though, I want them to be really proud of their heritage because we cannot yeah, sure, we could have plastic surgery, but we don't have the money to do plastic surgery. And not that I am encouraging anyone to, but we're going to look Asian. I'm going to look Asian until I die, and so are my kids. So you cannot remove yourself from how you look physically, and we should be all proud of whatever heritage, our, African heritage, our Native American heritage, whatever heritage, we should be proud because this is what makes us all beautiful human beings. And we have so much to learn from each other. And, I think who God is so large. You and I as a theologian, we cannot understand the fullness of God. So if we get different cultural perspectives and different gender perspectives, all these different ways, it just helps us to get a little bit closer to understanding this deep, immense mystery of who God is.
When you told the story earlier about your mom seeing the red ribbons in the corner of the room and going to tear them down,
Yeah.
right? Like part of the desire to do that is it's part of that kind of like deep desire for purity
Yeah.
in white religion
Uh-huh.
and kind of and metaphorically, what is it like to put the ribbons back up? We talked about this when we were working on the homebrewed book
Yeah.
in the series where you were like, look, the doctrine of the Spirit trip is, can you at least be one doctrine that isn't a bunch of dead Germans for 3/4 of it? And yeah, in the book, you joke about like, well, there are some beautiful things in the Presbyterian tradition that I'm there. It's just, what about chi, right? And in that fear that you raised in a number of places is this fear of syncretism,
Yeah.
because we have to be purely Christian.
Mhm.
But if you put in the full sentence and realize it really means pure white Christian,
Mhm.
then tearing down ribbons or erasing images of the divine or actually doing violence to your heritage rather than protecting it or keeping demons out and this kind of thing. So thinking about you discovering that and then trying to hand on the faith where the Reformed tradition and chi are both there, or the ribbons are on the corner of the room. What's that look like?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you. And I like that. I may have to write about the ribbon. I haven't written about it. I'm just sharing it probably for the first time right now on this Homebird Christianity podcast. You know, it's all tied in with the whiteness and that, white superiority and my culture is evil and bad and backwards. And so putting the ribbon back actually is something that I've been trying to do. And, people will say, oh, that sounds very syncretistic. And at the beginning, when people started accusing me of that, maybe 15 years ago, I really didn't have much to say. I just kind of stayed silent. But, now I always say, well, Christianity itself is syncretistic. It has always been. Where not that these religions exist in a very pure vacuum because human beings are living and practicing these religions, whether it be Christianity or Buddhism. Buddhism, it emerged in India, but then it spread to China, Korea, Japan. It's here, it's in different places. And when we see how Buddhism is practiced in different places, Of course, it's not the same as what it was in India, and even India itself is changing. Nothing stays the same. So I think Christians who get so uptight about syncretism, they have to understand that nothing stays the same because we practice it in different ways. So even Jesus breaking bread, that was flat bread. Much of us, many of us don't eat flat bread, and we use different types of bread in communion. It's not even the same. And so even that has changed. So many churches don't even want to use wine. We have to use grape juice. That little thing is change. It's modification. Maybe it's syncretism because some places we don't have bread. It's not a common thing. We may just use crackers or let's use other items. So we use whatever is available. That's just one example. But even our Christian practices of Easter is syncretism with pagan practices. So as long as we can continue to talk about how Europeans have syncretized Christianity and really point out so many of these ways, Easter and even Christmas, how that is all practiced, then when I talk about chi, it's really nothing compared to all of these other syncretistic practices. So, I think we really need to kind of be more open minded, be more welcoming because he is something that has existed for so long. And, in this book, I also talk about chi and spirit. And we just have to be aware of our own white Christianities that we grew up with so that we don't diminish other ways, other people practicing and putting their ribbons up. I think we need more languages and concepts. And, I think theologians have embraced the African concept of Ubuntu so open, with open arms. And I think that's a very helpful way for us to think about community and how we belong as a church and as people of faith. And, that is similarly in Korean concept of uri, which I also talk about in the book. So I think we should never shy away from other cultures and how they practice and the different concepts and philosophy and words that they use because it only enriches us. We only have a very limited view of Christianity from this Eurocentric patriarchal kind of heteronormative viewpoint. So the more perspectives we have, the post-colonial perspective, feminist, Black, Asian, the richer we will be and the more happier that we will be. I think me being so embarrassed of my own heritage was like really damaging to me psychologically. I thought I was going to go a little crazy, that I had to really remove myself. And even in my doctoral studies, really being challenged by non Asian theologians saying, this is a little weird. You should conform to the white patriarchal, Western Christianity and me fighting it. I have a lot more courage now, 30 years later, but when I was young, maybe it wasn't 30 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was younger, it was really hard to stand up for it because of just everything around me. But I really encourage the younger folks. None of my kids are going to go into theology that I can think of. But, as Christians, really embracing their heritage and putting their ribbons up and be really happy about it and be proud of it because that has been the long Christian history and tradition.
And I think that the kind of thinking that happens when we use the word syncretism is rather fascinating. That was one of my favorite parts of the conversation you and John Tatominal had at Theology Beer Camp. But one of my favorite parts was where y'all discussed all the kinds of syncretism we have no problems with.
Yeah.
Right. So that Christians are wonderfully syncretistic with extractive capitalism, and even celebrate the terms of that religious success in a worship service for someone who was executed by the state. No one goes, whoa, let's tear your 401k down from the wall. I'm worried. And so even the phrase syncretism and how it gets used right? It's not that there aren't times idolatrous images of God show up in the church. It's just if you've already internalized a bunch of them, then what you're scared of is this other, not the one you're familiar with. Yeah. So that question of idolatry gets raised, and I think a lot of times when you name it in a rather direct way, like a white male God, then in whatever way you think ultimacy really is reflected there, it kind of corresponds to just how protective you get
Yeah.
around the criticism.
Well, I must say that this Homeward Christianity theology bear camp was so well put together. So, Trip, thank you for that. And, I've since then I've met a lot of people as I spoke, and so many people are just talking still about all the work that you do online through your podcasts and your courses and the beer camp. Like that's been a highlight for so many people. So I really enjoyed, like, I've known John Tatalamo for a while, but I've never been on a panel with him ever or on stage with him. So I thought it worked out really well. He was hilarious and it was a good tag team. And being on that little panel afterwards, I thought it was great that you had these two Asians up there challenging our traditional kind of Christian thinking and theology. So I really, really, I thought it was so well done, and I really enjoyed being on it with John. I think we have a lot of challenging things to do and really pinpoint, as you said, about capitalism and other things, and saying, this is so wedded together so well and for so long, some of it 2,000 years old, that we failed to see it. I think that is a priority for so many of us. If we're really serious about fighting racism and sexism and homophobia and any other isms that there is, that is something that we really need to kind of practice and continue to do. At the end of my book, I do talk about some of the things that we need to be engaged in, and some of it is our liturgy. I know church attendance is dwindling, but those who go to church, if we continue to use white patriarchal language and images, um, it's gonna continue to do damage, so I think the liturgies have to change. Liturgies always have changed over time, so we shouldn't be so resistant, and as leaders in the church, ministers, I really encourage all of you to really change your liturgy, your prayers, and even some of the hymns to avoid some of the hymns that will continue to reinforce whiteness and patriarchy, which is really hard to do because so many of them are part of this. But that's
Hmm.
why we always come up with new hymn book, at least the Presbyterians do. Yeah.
the so there's one other question before we wrap up, and that's your own story and the way you learn to tell your own narrative as you learned more of the story of Korean immigration in America and Canada, and the kind of challenges even within Korean religious life for overcoming a kind of white male centric Christianity, and the power it has to shape immigrants' imagination that lead to kind of self judgment. I imagine, given where our country's going, the question of immigration is going to be coming up a lot.
Yeah.
And so often, religious communities' own self understanding and identity gets leveraged and activated, and it can be activated and pulled in different ways around the question of immigration. So, like knowing the kind of challenges we're likely to face as a nation in the near future, thinking about immigrants within the country, what way of kind of framing it would you suggest to avoid kind of continuing to center whiteness both in our Christian identity, our nation's identity, and kind of open up to a transformation beyond the kind of antagonistic assumptions?
Yeah, I think, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years, but immigration has just always been part of human history. And you see this in the biblical Old Testament times. People migrate due to agriculture, due to food, due to flooding, or, this climate change is an enormous problem, social justice problem of our time, one of the largest ones. So we are going to continue to see more migration. And I think when we see that, welcoming the foreigner is a key kind of concept in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. So I think we as Christians have to practice this, welcoming the stranger, the foreigner. And when we think about the foreign woman in the Old Testament passages, it's very interesting that the Israelite women, many of them were barren, but somehow God uses the foreign woman to give them children or to continue the lineage. So we see that in the story of Ruth and Naomi, a foreign woman who gives birth to the grandfather of King David. So I just find it so interesting how God uses the foreign women and foreigners to teach and to share and be part of the lineage of Jesus. I think that's an incredible historical story that we continue to share. So, whatever happens here in North America or around the world, really being able, we're living in a more globalized world. So, even though we're not face to face with people who have different culture, just on the web, we're just always Zooming with people from around the globe and listening to people from around the globe. I think being open and really accepting of one another. I think that's going to be the big challenge, accepting one another with their different language and cultures and even religions. I think this is going to be something that we really need to tackle with. And I hope to be part of this. I think that's going to be a really joyous event. We should not fear people of other religion and of other cultures. But that has been part of Christianity because, Christians, oh, we got to evangelize and convert them and everybody else is evil. Because at the end of the day, I'm thinking, what are all these different religions? Are they all the same or are they different? What is the intersectionality of these religions? Is it one God or many gods? These are questions that everybody has to kind of question. We shouldn't be so narrow-minded and say, okay, this is it. I'm just throwing out ideas for people, for your listeners, but there's a lot for us to be challenged by and to grow. I think it's going to be a new world as this world is becoming more globalized, that we can fly around within like 24 hours and be in another country. It's amazing, this world that we live in. And I hope, as I mentioned earlier, this climate change that we are part of, especially the rich nations, that we're not going to destroy this planet Earth. That's always a fear for many scientists, that we are on our way to destruction. So, this all intersects with Christianity and whiteness and this imperialism and empire building too. So there's a lot of things that we need to do. And, I encourage everybody to just be part of building better communities and a better church and welcoming the foreigner into your own communities.
Hey, you made it all the way through the episode. Congratulations. If you would like to help make this possible, I would absolutely love for you to head over to homebrewedcommunity.com. There, you'll be able to join the Substack community, process this, where you get ad-free versions of all the new episodes when they come out. You'll be able to get invites to live engagements, Zoom hangouts, and such. And it's a real easy way to help make this happen. Or you could join theologyclass.com. That is a place where you get access to the 45 plus online classes we've done, and we keep adding to it. I'm just saying, there are lots of ways to support the podcast, get access to extra content and interaction. And I deeply, deeply, deeply appreciate all of you who've helped make this part. So head over homebrewedcommunity.com and share the brew.